All right, so now we're going to look at the causes of inflation. I already kind of mentioned one already, so we'll look at that one, but we'll also talk about another one. So the other one that we haven't talked about yet is called supply-side inflation, and we'll see this in the next slide. But basically, when we have supply-side inflation, it's basically coming from a reduction in long-run aggregate supply, which we don't usually experience. But it does happen from time to time. It did happen during the Great Recession, although it didn't lead to much inflation because there was also a reduction in aggregate demand. So both of these things shifted to the left during the Great Recession. But supply-side inflation comes when the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. So what are some things that could cause this? Well, it could be that there's a reduction in labor force participation. This definitely happened shortly after the Great Recession. Another thing that could cause it are higher marginal tax rates on wages. So when people are taxed at a higher rate, they become less productive because the motivation to work and be productive is reduced if the government is taking more of your money from your job, from your income, right? So these are some things that can cause a leftward shift. So what would that look like? Well, if we've got a stable aggregate demand and our long-run aggregate supply shifts to the left, then we can see pretty clearly that would lead to an increase in prices. And so this is called supply-side inflation because it's coming from long-run aggregate supply. And then we also have demand-side inflation, which I've already mentioned. But basically, this is when long-run aggregate supply is maybe increasing, but aggregate demand is increasing even quicker, right? So if that's happening, then we have what's called demand-side inflation. And it's basically inflation that's coming from aggregate demand increasing. Okay, so this is what it looks like. And here in this chart, we see real GDP and the price level in the United States. So we can see that there's it looks like there's a positive correlation, right? It looks like increases in the price level positively correspond with real GDP, right? So we've got this sort of upward sloping trend here that we can kind of see. Pretty interesting chart. Trying to see if there's any interesting points. One interesting point, if you look at 1973, 1974, and 1975, we basically have no economic growth. The real GDP actually even decreases a little bit. But price level goes up. So this was a period of time known as stagflation because we had high unemployment, we didn't have economic growth, but prices were increasing. So previous to that point in time, economists thought that wasn't possible, but as it turns out, it is possible. And that's beyond the scope of this course. But if you're interested, feel free to email me and I can tell you more about that. Another interesting point to look at are the years 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010. So this is the Great Recession that we saw just a little over a decade ago, and so this is almost only one of the only points, 2009, where we actually see a decline in economic growth or a decline in real GDP. So that's a little interesting blip there as well to note. All right, and we're going to wrap this up with an international example. So inferring that South African aggregate demand dropped after 2008. Inferring just means, given the data, we can infer, right, that aggregate demand dropped. Just like when you look outside and it's dark, you can infer that it's nighttime, right? Even though it might not necessarily be nighttime. It could be that there's a solar eclipse, right? Anyway, that's what inferring means. So South Africa's average real GDP growth had declined from 5.6% growth between 1990 and 2008 to below 2.5% growth since 2008. So after the Great Recession. The average rate of increase in the price level has remained virtually unchanged. So their economic growth has slowed and their price level has basically remained the same. So basically what this means is that when its long-run aggregate supply curve has shifted to the right, and that shift to the right slowed, the aggregate demand for South Africa also shifted rightward at a slower pace, which would allowed it to its price level to remain the same.